Welcome to Story Comic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 416. I'm your host, Barney Smith of StoryComic.com, and we're excited to have with us the internationally acclaimed and Emmy Award-winning celebrated journalist and filmmaker, Robin Hamilton. Robin.
Woohoo! You made me sound so important. Thank you, Barney.
Well, this is
Thank you.
great. So we literally probably spent 20 minutes talking even before the interview started. So
Yes, we did. We did. I'm impressed by your 9 lives and all the things that you do. And it all started because I said, I enjoy your podcast and I love the diversity of people that you have on, and you don't often have filmmakers on too. And so then we started talking about our backgrounds and media, and it just went on from there.
it just went on from there. I know. See, and so look at that. So this must be where you're in. This is your study, your office that you're sitting in right
Yes.
now. Okay.
That is
Yeah.
correct. Yeah, absolutely.
And you have a lot of, it looks like framed accolades and awards and stuff floating around there too, huh?
It just looks, makes me look important. I got them at Target.
That's like, it's like when I get in those picture frames there, it's not even your, like, it's just like
Exactly,
completely
exactly.
different
Is this
people.
your family? No, I just like the people in the pictures.
Yeah.
Yeah, but thank
So
you. Thank you.
yeah. So you are now like as we mentioned before, you are a filmmaker now, and
I
but you
am.
originally started off as a journalist, correct?
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, I started off as a reporter. I was a local news reporter, and I just loved being able to tell people's stories. But as I often say, I was very grateful. In news, it's a great training ground because you learn to think on your feet quickly, you learn to write and listen to deadlines, and you have a great opportunity to learn how to condense a lot of information. A lot of times it would be complex information if you're covering the state house or city council, and condensing that down so that it is information that the public can use. And that's great. But I was also finding myself stuck in the cycle of crime. And I say crime and grime, but I was doing a lot of crime and weather in Vermont. I'm sure you can appreciate the weather. There's a lot of beautiful snow, but sometimes it can be a little long. And I was working in Boston. I had worked in Florida, so I covered a lot of rain and hurricanes. I worked in DC, so I covered courts and politics. And then I worked in Boston, where I covered a little bit of everything. And I found myself doing a lot more snow and weather and crime. And so I got to a point where I just said, I just feel like there's something more that I'm supposed to be doing. And so I was hosting a morning show. The show ended, and I went back to reporting, and I just didn't really think that that was where it was at for me. So, anyway, to make a long story short, my contract ended. I didn't think I was going to stay in Boston, and a colleague of mine knew someone in DC, and he connected me with this person who was looking for someone to host Black History Month specials and their public affairs news program. And so that's how I started to do a little bit more feature reporting and doing longer form content. And I was learning about different pieces, aspects of history in the DC area, and I had been interested in other pieces of history, stories of women in history. And I was pitching ideas, and I just wasn't
Mm.
getting accepted. I was getting my share of rejection. So finally, a friend of mine said, "Look, you're already." I was working freelance. That's kind of like having a client. So why don't you incorporate and start your own production company? And I said, I don't know anything about running a business and incorporating and all that. And she said, well, you'll learn. And that's what I ended up doing. So that's the condensed version of it. And it was definitely bumpy. It was a learning experience, but that's it in a nutshell, how I started.
And so, like for instance, and so that's basically how that initially drew you into documentary filmmaking. Is that's what drew you in then, correct?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, what really was the spark that pushed me was When I was in undergrad, actually, I was taking a class about women in the civil rights movement. And I
Mm,
had come across a great book by this author named Kay Mills, who did a book called This Little Light of Mine, The Life of Fannie Lou Hamer. And I had never heard of Fannie Lou Hamer, but when I got this book, she just entranced me. I thought she was amazing. She was this woman who was a sharecropper. She had a sixth grade education, was forced into sharecropping, and through a series of events and incredible bravery, ended up becoming the voice for fighting for the right to vote in Mississippi, and was really an integral part of helping get the Voting Rights Act passed. But she's often relegated to being a footnote in history because she was not a man. She didn't look, quote unquote, the part. She was, this stocky, unapologetic, strong-willed, you know, beautiful woman who just spoke her mind. And so she was often relegated to the side. But I wanted to create a love letter for her. And I didn't know what that looked like. And so I said, I'm gonna make a film about her. And initially I wanted to do a screenplay, and there's just a lot of nonsense that happens in Hollywood and screenplays. Things get lost in the ether. And if you don't know the right person, it's not happening. And I was meeting people. This is when you know a story gets in your bones. I was meeting people just throughout my career who she kept coming into my path. For example, when I went to Boston, the Democratic National Convention was there in 2004, and I know I'm dating myself, but I had just started out as a reporter, and there was a tribute to Mrs. Hamer's testimony at the Democratic National Convention. It was the 40th anniversary of her speech. And I met all these people who had worked with her, who had fought by her side, fighting for the right to vote. And so I met this great gentleman named Lawrence Giad who said, if you want to do something about her, let me know. I'm happy to talk to you. And I said, I'd love that. So several years passed by, and then I found out he passed away. And
oh,
then people who worked with her, it was like watching little pieces, just big pieces of history, just kind of vaporize before you. You had these legends who were passing away. And so I said, I have to do something now before I lose an opportunity. And I have to say, you had a great author, Daniel Jude Miller, on a couple weeks ago, and he had this great quote that basically said, "Make the book that you believe needs to be written, that you want to have written. Don't worry about what other people think. Don't worry about making something that's going to sell." And I know that a lot of business people would cringe hearing that, but as someone who's an artist and a business person, you probably appreciate that, because when you're true to yourself, what you create is very worthwhile. And so I made this film about Mrs. Hamer, and it did better than I could have ever expected. I thought it was going to be in a few libraries and shown during Black History Month, and that was it. And it ended up being on PBS nationally. It ended up being in schools. It ended up being distributed through an educational library. It really took on a life of its own. It was on in film festivals. And I think the thing that makes me the most proud is that no one was talking about her when I started down this path. I started in
mm,
2016, 2015, 2016, and the film didn't start getting momentum until 2017, 2018. And then all these little things started perking up about her. And,
right.
I don't know if you heard, but she posthumously was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom 2 weeks
Wow.
ago. Yeah, and she was never in the conversation. And so I am just thrilled that people are finally giving her due.
So yeah, this was your first foray at a
That's
documentary, and it's
yes,
This Little Light of Mine: The Legacy of Fannie Lou Hamer. Um,
yes,
27 minutes long, so it's
yes,
and that came out in 2015. But
yeah,
you didn't stop there, Robin, because then
yeah.
in 2017 you came out with Dignity and Defiance: A Portrait of
Mhm.
Mary Church Terrell.
Thank you. Yes, that's perfect. Yeah, that's exactly
Yeah.
right. And that's how you pronounce her name. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Talk to
thank
us a
you.
little bit about that one then.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Yeah, so at the time, I was working on, again, as a freelancer for another special for the Tribune TV station, which was where I was freelancing. And Mary Church Terrell's house, if you look at it modern day, it's this dilapidated half house in this area of LaDroit Park in
Hmm.
Washington, D.C., in Northwest D.C. And I remember looking at it and thinking, what is the deal with this house? And it's a national historic site that can't be touched. And so I went to a neighborhood meeting and sat in, and people were really annoyed that nothing had happened to, nothing's been done with the house. And it turns out this house years ago was the place where this suffragette, where this woman, she, if you can tell, she was a socialite. She was this well-to-do Black woman who was born of a gentleman who was a freed slave, who was very entrepreneurial, who made a lot of money and provided for his daughter. She was one of the first Black women to go to Oberlin College, and this was the turn of the century. And she, to make a long story short, she became one of the shining beacons of civil rights in the early 19th century, fighting for equality. And she continued. She had quite a long life. She lived into her, she lived, quite, I believe, into her 90s, but she helped desegregate lunch counters in Washington, D.C., right before Brown versus the Board of Education. So her house was a locale for organizing and intellectual leadership. And when she passed on, unfortunately, it passed hands in terms of ownership,
Hmm.
and it just kind of got lost in the fray. And what I wanted was to preserve her history, because the house in many respects represents how sometimes history, people forget, gets lost. History can get lost. And this woman had done so much, and she was worth being remembered, and her legacy is worth being remembered. And so now the great news is that the National Park Service has donated money, and Howard University has the deed to the house, and it's now in the process of being restored. And I don't know
Okay.
how long that process is, but I gave the film to Howard and to people who can use the film, hopefully, to raise money to restore the house.
Okay. Well, hey there. If you're enjoying our podcast, don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Your support means the world to us and helps us keep this show going. We love hearing from you, so any feedback is welcome. And thank you for being a part of our podcast family and for all your support. It truly means a lot to us. And it seems like, Robin, that you're coming out with like a documentary almost like every 2 years.
Oh,
Because right now it's like you have like Our Alexandria came out in
yes.
2019, then Odessa's Rain came out in
Yes.
2021. So, um, can you kind of discuss your research process when preparing for a new documentary or a new film?
Barney, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate you recognizing that, because, you know, yeah, I did. Some people take decades and decades to do a documentary. And for me, I feel like there's an urgency to get films done,
Hmm.
because I feel like these stories need to be told. So, for example, Odessa's Rain was a story that I found walking through the streets of Washington, D.C. I don't often get a day where I can just give myself a little bit of time to breathe. I call it a creative moment, creative days. But I had finished some meeting or something I had downtown. And so I was walking through the 14th Street corridor, and I just saw this plaque. I just stopped and looked at it. And this said, "Here is where the female Al Capone had, a lot of her parties." I thought, female Al Capone, who is this? And so I started to go down this path. I would take a little bit here, a little bit there. I would research, I would look up articles online, and then I would go to the library. I went to the National Archives, I went to the Library of Congress, and just started to look up this woman. So I say all that because when you research a film, a lot of times the material comes to you and sometimes it doesn't. And then you're trying to really coordinate with the fundraising piece of it too. So I have been very fortunate in that all of my films have been funded by grants. Now, pretty small grants, but fortunately, I have had grant help. And with a grant, you can get some assistance in terms of production or research. And because the grants were small and I'm impatient and I do want to have films done every 2 years, um, I just put my nose to the grindstone and just hole myself up in a library and just research and research. The other films that I had done, for example, are Alexandria or Mary Church Terrell. I really treat it as a almost like a long news feature piece where I
Mm.
have a calendar. I set specific days for the people that I'm going to interview, and then I go forward. And granted, I will say this is easier when it's a short. Doing a longer piece is a little bit harder. But with Odessa's Reign, it was harder because she was a black lesbian gangster in the 1950s, and people who knew her in DC are older and conservative and don't want to admit that maybe they knew a family member who went to her juke joint and ran some numbers with her, gambled a little bit on the horses. So that was hard. And I applied for a grant too initially, and I got rejected, which was a big blow because a grant cycle, it's a year. You apply for the money and then you wait. And I got rejected, and I had someone say there's no value in her story at all. And
Oh
that just
wow.
fueled me to, right, it was really obnoxious. And that just fueled me to apply for another grant. And I was so determined with this one. I just said, I will pay out of pocket to do this story because I think she's so interesting and I just think she deserves to be told. So anyway, to answer your question, I give myself 3 to 6 months to research. I do production in a very compressed piece of time, and then maybe 3 months, and then I use the remaining 3 months to edit and to do rewrites and edits again and fine cuts. So I try to finish it within a 1 to 2 year period, especially if I feel like there's something, there's something that's timely with the material.
Well, because you mentioned that the reason why it takes you so, you know, you're so specific in doing all that research. Do you think how much of a background of being a journalist has helped you be a successful uh, documentarian?
Thank you. I think it's helped me tremendously. It goes back to when I was saying when you first start out, you learn skills like researching and
Mm.
deadlines. I set deadlines for myself. I just said, I want to do this now. I want to do this now. I need to see this person. I need to interview X number of people by this date. And the other thing I will say too is that when you have a grant, often I would apply for production grants because with research grants, they're lovely. I've never been awarded a research grant, but production grants, you are in many respects required to have something to produce and show people at a certain amount of time. You have to show you have skin in the game. And
Mm.
so having to learn about deadlines and having to learn about production, that helped inform me greatly. And I think I do believe that's why I've been able to do the films that I've been able to do in the past couple of years.
And so, how do you balance, say, for instance, creative storytelling with like factual accuracy?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question because with Odessa's Reign, with a lot of the stories actually,
Right.
you do have to be creative. So Odessa's Reign, so Odessa had passed. She had been on a radio show. Do you remember Petey Green? Have you ever heard of the name Petey Green? He was kind of
Yeah.
this crazy disc jockey in, I think in the 70s. And so we weren't even around like when his show was on the air, but he he just had a name for he was kind of notorious. Anyway, to make a long story short, she was on that show and I had just looked and looked and looked for the footage for her and I couldn't find it. And I think it would have been really compelling to hear her voice and to see her speak. So what I did was I hired a voice actress to read her lines in from the Washington Post. So you have someone do the voiceover, and you make sure you put the disclaimer down there so you're not misleading anybody. So that was very important to me. I did not, you know what I mean? I did not want to mislead anybody to think that that was her, but I wanted them to hear her voice because there's a level of intimacy when you can hear someone's voice. So that's what I did for that. For our Alexandria, or for I'm not our Alexandria, for Resolved Never Again. That was a story about two young men who were lynched at the turn of the century in 1897 and 1899, and there were no pictures of these young boys. And I had two really great story editors who bounced some ideas around about how are we going to tell this story without pictures. I didn't want to do just a black screen. I didn't want to do just old pictures. So I decided, they said we should do some illustration. And then I decided what type of illustration, because they said, well, we could do 3D and CGI and all this other, all this AI. And I said, no, what I really wanted to do was pencil sketches, because the pencil sketches, there's something that's very innocent
Mm,
about pencil sketching and yet eerie, hearing the voices of these young men who are facing terror, who are in the face of a mob. And so I think juxtapose the childlike pictures, because they're very pretty, but they're not
right.
full of color and they're not really fancy. There's something very simple about them. And that purity, that simplicity, I think was a nice juxtaposition to the weight of what had happened to them. And so you have two voice actors narrating over what happened. And again, it was a reenactment based on the historical newspaper clippings of what happened, and one of the historians from the city of Alexandria had written it. And so I made sure I put a disclaimer explaining this is a reenactment based on
Mm,
historical facts. So I know some people think, oh, you're being, splitting hairs, but as a journalist, you want to be
right.
honest. And it goes back to what you said, Barney. You want to educate, inform, and entertain. And so I do want people to feel engaged in a story, but I'm also not going to, I don't want to lie.
Right. I mean, so what impact do you hope that your films will have on audiences?
I really want my films to be a vehicle for people to not only think, but to think about action they can take in
Mm,
some sort of way, and action that exemplifies that their voice matters. So, for example, with Odessa's Rain, someone had asked me, why are you telling this story? You're talking about a queer gangster who ran a brothel and became really wealthy. You're glamorizing crime. And I said, no, actually, I'm not glamorizing crime. Ultimately, I'm explaining what happens when you leave talent behind. So you had this brilliant woman who, because of the times, was not allowed to thrive. Who knows what she would have been? She created an underground economy because she had no opportunity. So I think in that respect, it's if you're in a position where you can select talent or bring people in, think about that. That's an act of that's an action that you can take. Think about when you leave talent behind and what that means, what that could mean for you. And for
right.
Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, for example, I think about her voice and how she really advocated that everyone's voice matters. And I think that's really the through line for everyone, for Mrs. Mary Church Terrell, for the artist I profiled, for Odessa. Everybody had a voice that was worth being mentioned, recognized, shared.
Mm,
And someone can learn something from that voice, even if it means it could encourage you to stand up for something you believe in,
right.
and that's how I feel. Again, just to reference really quickly the interview that you had with um Mariah Dawn, when I think you had asked her why she had written the memoir, and she had said she had never thought she would write a book, but then she realized oh, maybe I do have something to say, and maybe what I'm saying, someone else can benefit from that too. And that's what I
Right.
want people to take away from these films, that maybe you can be a voice for change. You never thought you could. Maybe you can be. Maybe you do have skills and talents that people have overlooked and that are worth sharing with the world.
So looking ahead then, are there any other topics or issues that you are particularly eager to explore?
That is an excellent question. I have to say, I'm torn because on one hand, I feel like there's more that I want to do with Odessa. I feel there's more. I feel like I'm. Have you ever been creative and you feel like you haven't finished the creative conversation yet? I feel
Yeah.
that way with her. Um, but I have to be honest, I have not given myself the mental space to think creatively yet. And that's something that I hear from creative people in terms of you have to give yourself space to breathe and think. And I haven't done that yet. So I haven't allowed myself to walk through, DC or somewhere and just given myself the opportunity to breathe. And I'm hoping that the next idea will come to me. I have little things percolating, but nothing that gets under my skin. Something has to get under me to make me tingle and go after it.
Right, because now as a documentary filmmaker, there's like people will write, authors will write autobiographies,
Yeah.
painters will do self-portraits. Can you do a autobiographical documentary about, because before we were on the air, you have a very amazing history yourself as well.
Oh, thank you. That is so nice of you to say. I never even thought about that. I don't know. Thank you. Um, I don't, that's interesting. That's really interesting. You said, one of the things I had thought about doing was a docu-series years ago when the recession hit, and this was when I first pivoted from reporting. And I left my reporting job, but I was meeting a lot of people who had gotten laid off. And I had created a docu-series called Let the Layoff Pay Off about how people were being creative. But it never went anywhere because it was really fun conversations.
Mm.
And so sometimes I think about revisiting that, but I don't know. That's a really nice question. Thank you. Thank you for thinking I'm interesting. My sister would laugh at you. She would say, "Why?"
For our viewers and listeners out there, if they want to learn more about you, Robin, you have a website, correct, that they could go to?
Yes, absolutely. If you go to www.aroundrobin.com and you can see all my work, and just go to the films tab and you can see the films that we talked about. You can check out the trailers, and if you want, you can subscribe for a year. You get access to all of my content, not only the 5 films, but I also did something called Taste the 202. I'm based in DC, and that's about a couple of historical hotspots in Washington DC that have a lot of history to them, and how history and food tie together. So thank you for that. Yeah,
Yeah.
roundrobin.com.
Excellent. And so, Robin, when you have your newest documentary, you're gonna have to come back on. We'll have to talk about it again.
Absolutely. I would love to do that. Thank you.
Okay, you're used to being in front of the camera.
I am, yeah. But I can tell you would actually, you were very natural interviewing people when I was listening to your other podcasts. So I'm like, oh, that's why I guess I'm not surprised that you have these radio stations, because I'm like, he seems to know what he's doing.
It's all, you got to fake it till you make it, Robin. See?
Yeah.